Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. Before we begin this evening, I'd like to thank all of our Patreon subscribers, including our newest subscriber, Samantha Gamayan. Samantha, thank you so much for your support. It helps make this podcast possible. If anyone is interested in the exclusive perks available to Patreon subscribers, you'll find a link to the page in the show notes. Now let's get to the reading. Tonight's book comes by way of recommendation from listener Jeremy Zenith, and it is absolutely perfect for this podcast. Tonight we're reading The Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gaston Camille Charles Maspero, DCL Oxford, member of the Institute of France, professor at the Collège de France, ex-director general of Egyptian Museums, translated by Amelia B. Edwards, new edition, revised and enlarged by the author, with 309 illustrations, published in 1895. Let's begin. Preface to the fourth and revised edition. Notwithstanding the fact that Egyptology is now recognized as a science, an exact and communicable knowledge of whose existence and scope it behooves all modern culture to take cognizance, this work of Monsieur Maspero still remains the handbook of Egyptian archaeology. But Egyptology is as yet in its infancy. Whatever their age, Egyptologists will long die young. Every year, almost every month, fresh material for the study is found. Fresh light is thrown upon it by the progress of excavation, exploration, and research. Hence it follows that, in the course of a few years, the standard textbooks require considerable addition and modification if they are to be of the greatest value to students, who must always start from the foremost vantage ground. The increasing demand for the Egyptian archaeology by English and American tourists, as well as students, decided the English publishers to issue a new edition in as light and portable a form as possible. This edition is carefully corrected and contains the enlarged letterpress and many fresh illustrations necessary for incorporating within the book adequate accounts of the main archaeological results of recent Egyptian excavations. Monsieur Maspero has himself revised the work, indicated all the numerous additions, and qualified the expression of any views which he has seen reason to modify in the course of his researches during the past 8 years. By the headings of the pages, the descriptive titles of the illustrations, and a minute revision of the index, much has been done to facilitate the use of the volume as a book of reference. In that capacity, it will be needed by the student long after he first makes acquaintance with its instructive and abundant illustrations, and its luminous condensation of the archaeological facts and conclusions which have been elucidated by Egyptology through the devotion of many an arduous lifetime during the present century, and not least by the unremitting labors of Monsieur Maspero. April 1895. Preface to the first edition. To put this book into English, and thus to hand it on to thousands who might not otherwise have enjoyed it, has been to me a very congenial and interesting task. It would be difficult, I imagine, to point to any work of its scope and character which is better calculated to give lasting delight to all classes of readers. For the skilled archaeologist, its pages contain not only new facts, but new views and new interpretations, while to those who know little or perhaps nothing of the subjects under discussion, it will open a fresh and fascinating field of study. It is not enough to say that a handbook of Egyptian archaeology was much needed, and that Professor Maspero has given us exactly what we required. He has done much more than this. He has given us a picturesque, vivacious, and highly original volume, as delightful as if it were not learned, and as instructive as if it were dull. As regards the practical side of archaeology, it ought to be unnecessary to point out that its usefulness is strictly parallel with the usefulness of public museums. To collect and exhibit objects of ancient art and industry is worse than idle if we do not also endeavor to disseminate some knowledge of the history of those arts and industries, and of the processes employed by the artists and craftsmen of the past. Archaeology, no less than love, adds a precious seeing to the eye, and without that gain of mental sight, the treasures of our public collections are regarded by the general visitor as mere curiosities, flat and stale for the most part, and wholly unprofitable. I am much indebted to Mr. W. M. Flinders Petrie, author of the Pyramids and Temples of Giza, for kindly translating the section on pyramids, which is entirely from his pen. I have also to thank him for many valuable notes on subjects dealt with in the first 3 chapters. To avoid confusion, I have numbered these notes and placed them at the end of the volume. My acknowledgments are likewise due to Professor Maspero for the care with which he has read the proof sheets of this version of his work. In departing from his system of orthography and that of Mr. Petrie, I have been solely guided by the necessities of English readers. I foresee that Egyptian archaeology will henceforth be the inseparable companion of all English-speaking travelers who visit the valley of the Nile. Hence I have, for the most part, adopted the spelling of Egyptian proper names as given by the author of Murray's Handbook for Egypt. Touching my own share in the present volume, I will only say that I have tried to present Professor Maspero's inimitable French in the form of readable English, rather than in a strictly word-for-word translation, and that with the hope of still further extending the usefulness of the book, I have added some footnote references. Amelia B. Edwards, Westbury-on-Trim, August 1887. Egyptian Archaeology, Chapter 1, Architecture, Civil and Military. Archaeologists, when visiting Egypt, have so concentrated their attention upon temples and tombs that not one has devoted himself to a careful examination of the existing remains of private dwellings and military buildings. Few countries, nevertheless, have preserved so many relics of their ancient civil architecture. Setting aside towns of Roman or Byzantine date, such as are found almost intact at Khoft, at Kom Ombo, and at El Agandiye, 1/2 at least of ancient Thebes still exists on the east and south of Karnak. The site of Memphis is covered with mounds, some of which are from 50 to 60 feet in height, each containing a core of houses in good preservation. At Kahun, the ruins and remains of a whole provincial 12th dynasty town have been laid bare. At Tel al-Maskuta, the granaries of Pithom are yet standing. At San and Tel Basta, the Ptolemaic and Saitic cities contain quarters of which plans might be made, and in many localities which escape the traveler's notice, there may be seen ruins of private dwellings which date back to the age of the Ramessids or to a still earlier period, while the ramparts of El Kab, of Qom el Amar, of El Hibe, and of Dake, as well as part of the fortifications of Thebes, are still standing and await the architect who shall deign to make them an object of serious study. 1. Private dwellings. The soil of Egypt, periodically washed by the inundation, is a black, compact, homogeneous clay, which becomes of stony hardness when dry. From immemorial time, the Falahin have used it for the construction of their houses. The hut of the poorest peasant is a mere rudely shaped mass of this clay. A rectangular space, some 8 or 10 feet in width, by perhaps 16 or 18 feet in length, is enclosed in a wickerwork of palm branches coated on both sides with a layer of mud. As this coating cracks in the drying, the fissures are filled in, and more coats of mud are daubed on until the walls attain a thickness of from 4 inches to a foot. Finally, the whole is roofed over with palm branches and straw, the top being covered in with a thin layer of beaten earth. The height varies. In most huts, the ceiling is so low that to rise suddenly is dangerous both to one's head and to the structure, while in others, the roof is 6 or 7 feet from the floor. Windows, of course, there are none. Sometimes a hole is left in the middle of the roof to let the smoke out, but this is a refinement undreamed of by many. At the first glance, it is not always easy to distinguish between these huts of wattle and daub and those built with crude bricks. The ordinary Egyptian brick is a mere oblong block of mud mixed with chopped straw and a little sand and dried in the sun. At a spot where they are about to build, one man is told off to break up the ground. Others carry the clods and pile them in a heap, while others again mix them with water, knead the clay with their feet, and reduce it to a homogeneous paste. This paste, when sufficiently worked, is pressed by the head workman in molds made of hard wood, while an assistant carries away the bricks as fast as they are shaped and lays them out in rows at a little distance apart to dry in the sun. A careful brickmaker will leave them thus for half a day or even for a whole day, after which the bricks are piled in stacks in such wise that the air can circulate freely among them, and so they remain for a week or 2 before they are used. More frequently, however, they are exposed for only a few hours to heat of the sun, and the building is begun while they are yet damp. The mud, however, is so tenacious that notwithstanding this carelessness, they are not readily put out of shape. The outer faces of the bricks become disintegrated by the action of the weather, but those in the inner part of the wall remain intact and are still separable. A good modern workman will easily mold 1,000 bricks a day, and after a week's practice he may turn out to 1,200, 1,500, or even 1,800. The ancient workmen, whose appliances in no wise differed from those of the present day, produced equally satisfactory results. The dimensions they generally adopted were 8.7 by 4.3 by 5.5 inches for ordinary bricks, or 15 by 7.1 by 5.5 for a larger size, though both larger and smaller are often met with in the same ruins. Bricks issued from the royal workshops were sometimes stamped with the cartouches of the reigning monarch, while those made in private factories bore on the side a trademark in red ochre, a squeeze of the molder's fingers, or the stamp of the maker. By far the greater number have, however, no distinctive mark. Burnt bricks were not often used before the Roman period, nor tiles, either flat or curved. Glazed bricks appear to have been the fashion in the Delta. The finest specimen that I have seen, namely one in the Giza Museum, is inscribed in black ink with the cartouches of Ramses III. The glaze of this brick is green, but other fragments are colored blue, red, yellow, or white. The nature of the soil does not allow for deep foundations. It consists of a thin bed of made earth, which, except in large towns, never reaches any degree of thickness. Below this comes a very dense humus, permeated by slender veins of sand, and below this again, at the level of infiltration, comes a bed of mud, more or less soft, according to the season. The native builders of the present day are content to remove only the made earth, and lay their foundations on the primeval soil, or if that lies too deep, they stop at a yard or so below the surface. The old Egyptians did likewise, and I have never yet seen any ancient house of which the foundations were more than 4 feet deep. Even this is exceptional, the depth in most cases being not more than 2 feet. They very often did not trouble themselves to cut trenches at all. They merely leveled the space intended to be covered, and having probably watered it to settle the soil, they at once laid the bricks upon the surface. When the house was finished, the scraps of mortar, the broken bricks, and all the accumulated refuse of the work made a bed of 8 inches or a foot in depth, and the base of the wall thus buried served instead of a foundation. When the new house rose on the ruins of an older one decayed by time or ruined by accident, the builders did not even take the trouble to raze the old walls to the ground. Leveling the surface of the ruins, they built upon them at a level a few feet higher than before. Thus, each town stands upon one or several artificial mounds, the tops of which may occasionally rise to a height of from 60 to 80 feet above the surrounding country. The Greek historians attributed these artificial mounds to the wisdom of the kings, and especially to Sesostris, who, as they supposed, wished to raise the towns above the inundation. Some modern writers have even described the process, which they explain thus: a cellular framework of brick walls, like a huge chessboard, formed the substructure, the cells being next filled in with earth, and the houses built upon this immense platform. But where I have excavated, especially at Thebes, I have never found anything answering to this conception. The intersecting walls which one finds beneath the later houses are nothing but the ruins of older dwellings, which in turn rest on others still older. The slightness of the foundations did not prevent the builders from boldly running up quite lofty structures. In the ruins of Memphis, I have observed walls still standing from 30 to 40 feet in height. The builders took no precaution beyond enlarging the base of the wall and vaulting the floors. The thickness of an ordinary wall was about 16 inches for a low house, but for one of several stories, it was increased to 3 or 4 feet. Large beams, embedded here and there in the brickwork or masonry, bound the whole together and strengthened the structure. The ground floor was also frequently built with dressed stones, while the upper parts were of brick. The limestone of the neighboring hills was the stone commonly used for such purposes. The fragments of sandstone, granite, and alabaster, which are often found mixed in with it, are generally from some ruined temple, the ancient Egyptians having pulled their neglected monuments to pieces quite as unscrupulously as do their modern successors. The houses of an ancient Egyptian town were clustered round its temple, and the temple stood in a rectangular enclosure to which access was obtained through monumental gateways in the surrounding brick wall. The gods dwelt in fortified mansions, or at any rate in redoubts to which the people of the place might fly for safety in the event of any sudden attack upon their town. Such towns as were built all at once by prince or king were fairly regular in plan, having wide paved streets at right angles to each other, and the buildings in line. The older cities, whose growth had been determined by the chances and changes of centuries, were characterized by no such regularity. Their houses stood in a maze of blind alleys and narrow, dark, and straggling streets, with here and there the branch of a canal almost dried up during the greater part of the year, and a muddy pond where the cattle drank and women came for water. Somewhere in each town was an open space shaded by sycamores or acacias, and hither on market days came the peasants of the district 2 or 3 times in the month. There were also waste places where rubbish and refuse was thrown, to be quarreled over by vultures, hawks, and dogs. The lower classes lived in mere huts, which, though built of bricks, were no better than those of the present Falahin. At Karnak, in the pharaonic town, at Kom in the Roman town, and at Medina Habu in the Coptic town, the houses in the poorer quarters have seldom more than 12 or 16 feet of frontage. They consist of a ground floor, with sometimes 1 or 2 living rooms above. The middle-class folk, as shopkeepers, sub-officials, and foremen, were better housed. Their houses were brick-built and rather small, yet contained some half-dozen rooms communicating by means of doorways, which were usually arched over, and having vaulted roofs in some cases, and in others flat ones. Some few of the houses were 2 or 3 stories high, and many were separated from the street by a narrow court, beyond which the rooms were ranged on either side of a long passage. More frequently, the court was surrounded on 3 sides by chambers, and yet oftener the house fronted close upon the street. In the latter case, the facade consisted of a high wall, whitewashed or painted, and surmounted by a cornice. Even in better houses, the only ornamentation of their outer walls consisted in angular grooving, the grooves being surmounted by representations of 2 lotus flowers, each pair with the upper parts of the stalks in contact. The door was the only opening, save perhaps a few small windows pierced at irregular intervals. Even in unpretentious houses, the door was often made of stone. The doorposts projected slightly beyond the surface of the wall, and the lintel supported a painted or sculptured cornice. Having crossed the threshold, one passed successively through two dimly lighted entrance chambers, the second of which opened into the central court. The best rooms in the houses of wealthier citizens were sometimes lighted through a square opening in the center of a ceiling supported on wooden columns. In the 12th dynasty town of Kahun, the shafts of these columns rested upon round stone bases. They were octagonal and about 10 inches in diameter. Notwithstanding the prevalence of enteric disease and ophthalmia, the family crowded together into 1 or 2 rooms during the winter and slept out on the roof under the shelter of mosquito nets in summer. On the roof also, the women gossiped and cooked. The ground floor included both storerooms, barns, and stables. Private granaries were generally in pairs, brick built in the same long conical shape as the state granaries, and carefully plastered with mud inside and out. Neither did the people of a house forget to find or to make hiding places in the walls or floors of their home, where they could secrete their household treasures, such as nuggets of gold and silver, precious stones, and jewelry for men and women, from thieves and tax collectors alike. Wherever the upper floors still remained standing, they reproduced the ground floor plan with scarcely any differences. These upper rooms were reached by an outside staircase, steep and narrow, and divided at short intervals by small square landings. The rooms were oblong and were lighted only from the doorway. When it was decided to open windows on the street, they were mere air holes near the ceiling, pierced without regularity or symmetry, fitted with a lattice of wooden crossbars and secured by wooden shutters. The floors were bricked or paved, or consisted still more frequently of merely a layer of rammed earth. The rooms were not left undecorated. The mud plaster of the walls, generally in its native gray, although whitewashed in some cases, was painted with red or yellow, and ornamented with drawings of interior and exterior views of a house, and of household vessels and eatables. The roof was flat, and made probably, as at the present day, of closely laid rows of palm branches, covered with a coating of mud thick enough to withstand the effects of rain. Sometimes it was surmounted by only 1 or 2 of the usual Egyptian ventilators, but generally there was a small wash-house on the roof, and a little chamber for the slaves or guards to sleep in. The household fire was made in a hollow of the earthen floor, usually to one side of the room, and the smoke escaped through a hole in the ceiling. Branches of trees, charcoal, and dried cakes of ass or cow dung were used for fuel. The mansions of the rich and great covered a large space of ground. They most frequently stood in the midst of a garden, or of an enclosed court planted with trees, and, like the commoner houses, they turned a blank front to the street consisting of bare walls, battlemented like those of a fortress. Thus home life was strictly secluded, and the pleasure of seeing was sacrificed for the advantages of not being seen. The door was approached by a flight of 2 or 3 steps, or by a porch supported on columns and adorned with statues, which gave it a monumental appearance and indicated the social importance of the family. Sometimes this was preceded by a pylon gateway, such as usually heralded the approach to a temple. Inside the enclosure, it was like a small town, divided into quarters by irregular walls. The dwelling house stood at the farther end, the granaries, stabling, and open spaces being distributed in different parts of the grounds, according to some system to which we as yet possess no clue. These arrangements, however, were infinitely varied. If I would convey some idea of the residence of an Egyptian noble, a residence half palace, half villa, I cannot do better than reproduce two out of the many pictorial plans which have come down to us among the tomb paintings of the 18th dynasty. The first plans represent a Theban house. The enclosure is square and surrounded by an embattled wall. The main gate opens upon a road bordered with trees, which runs beside a canal or perhaps an arm of the Nile. Low stone walls divide the garden into symmetrical compartments, like those which are seen to this day in the great gardens of Ekmim or Gergeh. In the center is a large trellis supported on 4 rows of slender pillars. 4 small ponds, 2 to the right and 2 to the left, are stocked with ducks and geese. 2 nurseries, 2 summer houses, and various avenues of sycamores, date palms, and dom palms fill up the intermediate space, while at the end, facing the entrance, stands a small 3-storied house surmounted by a painted cornice. The second plan is copied from one of the rock-cut tombs of Tel El Amarna. Here we see a house situate at the end of the gardens of the great Lord Ai, son-in-law of the pharaoh Khuenatun, and himself afterwards king of Egypt. An oblong stone tank with sloping sides and 2 descending flights of steps faces the entrance. The building is rectangular, the width being somewhat greater than the depth. A large doorway opens in the middle of the front and gives access to a court planted with trees and flanked by storehouses fully stocked with provisions. 2 small courts placed symmetrically in the 2 farthest corners contain the staircases which lead up to the roof terrace. This first building, however, is but the frame which surrounds the owner's dwelling. The 2 frontages are each adorned with a pillared portico and a pylon. Passing the outer door, we enter a sort of long central passage, divided by 2 walls pierced with doorways, so as to form 3 successive courts. The inside court is bordered by chambers. The 2 others open to right and left upon 2 smaller courts, whence flights of steps lead up to the terraced roof. This central building is called the Akhenuti, or private dwelling of kings or nobles, to which only the family and intimate friends had access. The number of stories and the arrangement of the facade varied according to the taste of the owner. The frontage was generally a straight wall. Sometimes it was divided into 3 parts, with the middle division projecting, in which case the 2 wings were ornamented with a colonnade to each story, or surmounted by an open gallery. The central pavilion sometimes presents the appearance of a tower, which dominates the rest of the building. The facade is often decorated with slender colonnettes of painted wood, which bear no weight and merely serve to lighten the somewhat severe aspect of the exterior. Of the internal arrangements, we know but little. As in the middle-class houses, the sleeping rooms were probably small and dark, but on the other hand, the reception rooms must have been nearly as large as those still in use in the Arab houses of modern Egypt. The decoration of walls and ceilings in no wise resembled such scenes or designs as we find in the tombs. The panels were whitewashed or color-washed and bordered with a polychrome band. The ceilings were usually left white. Sometimes, however, they were decorated with geometrical patterns, which repeated the leading motives employed in the sepulchral wall paintings. Thus we find examples of meanders interspersed with rosettes, particolored squares, ox heads seen frontwise, scrolls, and flights of geese. I have touched chiefly upon houses of the Second Theban period, this being in fact the time of which we have most examples. The house-shaped lamps which are found in such large numbers in the Fayum date only from Roman times, but the Egyptians of that period continued to build according to the rules which were in force under the pharaohs of the 12th, 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. As regards the domestic architecture of the ancient kingdom, the evidences are few and obscure. Nevertheless, the stelae, tombs, and coffins of that period often furnish designs which show us the style of the doorways, and one 4th dynasty sarcophagus, that of Khufu Posku, is carved in the likeness of a house. 2. Fortresses. Most of the towns and even most of the larger villages of ancient Egypt were walled. This was an almost necessary consequence of the geographical characteristics and the political constitution of the country. The mouths of the defiles which led into the desert needed to be closed against the Bedouin, while the great feudal nobles fortified their houses, their towns, and the villages upon their domains which commanded either the mountain passes or the narrow parts of the river against their king or their neighbors. The oldest fortresses are those of Abydos, El-Kab, and Semneh. Abydos contained a sanctuary dedicated to Osiris and was situate at the entrance to one of the roads leading to the oasis. As the renown of the temple attracted pilgrims, so the position of the city caused it to be frequented by merchants. Hence the prosperity which it derived from the influx of both classes of strangers exposed the city to incursions of the Libyan tribes. At Abydos there yet remain 2 almost perfect strongholds, the older forms, as it were, the core of that tumulus called by the Arabs Qomas Sultan, or the Mound of the King. The interior of this building has been excavated to a point some 10 or 12 feet above the ground level, but the walls outside have not yet been cleared from the surrounding sand and rubbish. In its present condition, it forms a parallelogram of crude brickwork measuring 410 feet from north to south and 223 feet from east to west. The main axis of the structure extends, therefore, from north to south. The principal gateway opens in the western wall, not far from the northwest corner, but there would appear to have been 2 smaller gates, one in the south front and one in the east. The walls, which now stand from 24 to 36 feet high, have lost somewhat of their original height. They are about 6 feet thick at the top. They were not built altogether in uniform layers, but in huge vertical panels, easily distinguished by the arrangement of the brickwork. In one division, the bedding of the bricks is strictly horizontal. In the next, it is slightly concave and forms a very flat reversed arch, of which the extrados rests upon the ground. The alternation of these 2 methods is regularly repeated. The object of this arrangement is obscure, but it is said that buildings thus constructed are especially fitted to resist earthquake shocks. However this may be, the fortress is extremely ancient, for in the 5th dynasty, the nobles of Abydos took possession of the interior and ultimately so piled it up with their graves as to deprive it of all strategic value. a second stronghold, erected a few hundred yards further to the southeast, replaced that of Comus Sultan about the time of the 12th dynasty, and narrowly escaped the fate of the first under the rule of the Ramessids. Nothing, in fact, but the sudden decline of the city saved the second from being similarly choked and buried. The early Egyptians possessed no engines calculated to make an impression on very massive walls. They knew of but 3 ways of forcing a stronghold, namely scaling the walls, sapping them, or bursting open the gates. The plan adopted by their engineers in building the second fort is admirably well calculated to resist each of these modes of attack. The outer walls are long and straight, without towers or projections of any kind. They measure 430 feet in length from north to south by 255 feet in width. The foundations rest on the sand and do not go down more than a foot. The wall is of crude brick in horizontal courses. It has a slight batter, is solid without slits or loopholes, and is decorated outside with long vertical grooves or panels, like those depicted on the stelae of the ancient empire. In its present state, it rises to a height of some 36 feet above the plain. When perfect, it would scarcely have exceeded 40 feet, which height would amply suffice to protect the garrison from all danger of scaling by portable ladders. The thickness of the wall is about 20 feet at the base and 16 feet above. The top is destroyed, but the bas-reliefs and mural paintings show that it must have been crowned with a continuous cornice, boldly projecting, furnished with a slight low parapet and surmounted by battlements, which were generally rounded, but sometimes, though rarely, squared. The walk round the top of the ramparts, though diminished by the parapet, was still 12 or 15 feet wide. It ran uninterruptedly along the 4 sides, and was reached by narrow staircases formed in the thickness of the walls, but now destroyed. There was no ditch, but in order to protect the base of the main wall from sappers, they erected about 10 feet in advance of it a battlemented covering wall some 16 feet in height. These precautions sufficed against sap and scaling, but the gates remained as open gaps in the circuit. It was upon these weak points that besiegers and besieged alike concentrated their efforts. The fortress of Abydos had 2 gates, the main one being situate at the east end of the north front. A narrow cutting, closed by a massive wooden door, marked the place in the covering wall. Behind it was a small place d'armes, cut partly in the thickness of the wall, and leading to a second gate as narrow as the first. When, notwithstanding the showers of missiles poured upon them from the top of the walls, not only in front, but also from both sides, the attacking party had succeeded in carrying this second door, they were not yet in the heart of the place. They would still have to traverse an oblong court, closely hemmed in between the outer walls and the cross walls, which last stood at right angles to the first. Finally, they must force a last postern, which was purposely placed in the most awkward corner. The leading principle in the construction of fortress gates was always the same, but the details varied according to the taste of the engineer. At the south gate of the fort of Abydos, the place d'armes between the 2 walls is abolished, and the court is constructed entirely in the thickness of the main wall, while at Qom el Amar, opposite El Kab, the block of brickwork in the midst of which the gate is cut projects boldly in front. The posterns opening at various points facilitated the movements of the garrison and enabled them to multiply their sorties. The same system of fortification which was in use for isolated fortresses was also employed for the protection of towns. At Heliopolis, at San, at Sais, at Thebes, everywhere in short, we find long straight walls forming plain squares or parallelograms, without towers or bastions, ditches or outworks. The thickness of the walls, which varied from 30 to 80 feet, made such precautions needless. The gates, or at all events the principal ones, had jambs and lintels of stone, decorated with scenes and inscriptions, as for instance that of Ombos, which Champollion beheld yet in situ, and which dated from the reign of Thutmosis III. The oldest and best preserved walled city in Egypt, namely El Kab, belongs probably to the ancient empire. The Nile washed part of it away some years ago, but at the beginning of the present century it formed an irregular quadrilateral enclosure measuring some 2,100 feet in length by about a quarter less in breadth. The south front is constructed on the same principles as the wall at Qomes Sultan, the bricks being bedded in alternate horizontal and concave sections. Along the north and west fronts, they are laid in undulating layers from end to end. The thickness is 38 feet, and the average height 30 feet, and spacious ramps lead up to the walk upon the walls. The gates are placed irregularly, one in each side to north, east, and west, but none in the south face. They are, however, in too ruinous a state to admit of any plan being taken of them. The enclosure contained a considerable population, whose dwellings were unequally distributed, the greater part being concentrated towards the north and west, where excavations have disclosed the remains of a large number of houses. The temples were grouped together in a square enclosure, concentric with the outer wall, and this second enclosure served for a keep, where the garrison could hold out long after the rest of the town had fallen into the hands of the enemy. The rectangular plan, though excellent in a plain, was not always available in a hilly country. When the spot to be fortified was situate upon a height, the Egyptian engineers knew perfectly well how to adapt their lines of defense to the nature of the site. At Kom Ombo, the walls exactly followed the outline of the isolated mound on which the town was perched, and presented towards the east a front bristling with irregular projections, the style of which roughly resembles our modern bastions. At Kume and Semne in Nubia, where the Nile rushes over the rocks of the Second Cataract, the engineering arrangements are very ingenious and display much real skill. Usertesen III had fixed on this pass as the frontier of Egypt, and the fortresses which he there constructed were intended to bar the waterway against the vessels of the neighboring tribes. At Kume, on the right bank, the position was naturally strong. Upon a rocky height, surrounded by precipices, was planned an irregular square measuring about 200 feet each way. Two elongated bastions, one on the northeast and the other on the southeast, guarded respectively the path leading to the gate and the course of the river. The covering wall stood 13 feet high and closely followed the line of the main wall, except at the north and south corners, where it formed two bastion-like projections. At Semne, on the opposite bank, the site was less favorable. The east side was protected by a belt of cliffs, going sheer down to the water's edge, but the three other sides were well nigh open. A straight wall about 50 feet in height carried along the cliffs on the side next the river, but the walls looking towards the plain rose to 80 feet and bristled with bastion-like projections, jutting out for a distance of 50 feet from the curtain wall, measuring 30 feet thick at the base and 13 feet at the top, and irregularly spaced according to the requirements of the defense. These spurs, which are not battlemented, served in place of towers. They added to the strength of the walls, protected the walk round the top, and enabled the besieged to direct a flank attack against the enemy if any attempt were made upon the wall of circuit. The intervals between these spurs are accurately calculated as to distance, in order that the archers should be able to sweep the intervening ground with their arrows. Curtains and salients are alike built of crude brick, with beams bedded horizontally in the mass. The outer face is in two parts, the lower division being nearly vertical, and the upper one inclined at an angle of about 70 degrees, which made scaling very difficult, if not impossible. The whole of the ground enclosed by the wall of circuit was filled in to nearly the level of the ramparts. Externally, the covering wall of stone was separated from the body of the fortress by a dry ditch, some 100 to 130 feet in width. This wall closely followed the main outline and rose to a height which varied according to the situation from 6 to 10 feet above the level of the plain. On the northward side it was cut by the winding road, which led down into the plain. These arrangements, skillful as they were, did not prevent the fall of the place. A large breach in the southward face, between the two salients nearest to the river, marks the point of attack selected by the enemy. New methods of fortification were revealed to the Egyptians in the course of the great Asiatic wars undertaken by the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. The nomadic tribes of Syria erected small forts in which they took refuge when threatened with invasion. The Canaanite and Hittite cities, as Ascalon, Dapur, and Miram, were surrounded by strong walls, generally built of stone and flanked with towers. Those which stood in the open country, as for instance Kadesh, were enclosed by a double moat. Having proved the efficacy of these new types of defensive architecture in the course of their campaigns, the pharaohs reproduced them in the valley of the Nile. From the beginning of the 19th dynasty, the eastern frontier of the Delta, always the weakest, was protected by a line of forts constructed after the Canaanite model. The Egyptians, moreover, not content with appropriating the thing, appropriated also the name, and called these frontier towers by the Semitic name of Magdilu or Migdols. For these purposes, or at all events for cities which were exposed to the incursions of the Asiatic tribes, brick was not deemed to be sufficiently strong. Hence the walls of Heliopolis and even those of Memphis were faced with stone. Of these new fortresses no ruins remain, and but for a royal caprice which happens to have left us a model Migdol in that most unlikely place, the necropolis of Thebes, we should now be constrained to attempt a restoration of their probable appearance from the representations in certain mural tableaux. When, however, Ramses III erected his memorial temple, he desired, in remembrance of his Syrian victories, to give it an outwardly military aspect. Along the eastward front of the enclosure, there accordingly runs a battlemented covering wall of stone, averaging some 13 feet in height. The gate, protected by a large quadrangular bastion, opened in the middle of this wall. It was 3 feet 4 inches in width, and was flanked by 2 small oblong guardhouses, the flat roofs of which stood about 3 feet higher than the ramparts. Passing this gate, we stand face to face with a real Migdal. 2 blocks of building enclose a succession of courtyards, which narrow as they recede and are connected at the lower end by a kind of gatehouse, consisting of one massive gateway surmounted by 2 stories of chambers. The eastward faces of the towers rise above an inclined basement, which slopes to a height of from 15 to 16 feet from the ground. This answered 2 purposes. It increased the strength of the wall at the part exposed to sappers. It also caused the rebound of projectiles thrown from above, and so helped to keep assailants at a distance. The whole height is about 72 feet, and the width of each tower is 32 feet. The buildings situate at the back, to right and left of the gate, were destroyed in ancient times. The details of the decoration are partly religious, partly triumphal, as befits the character of the structure. It is unlikely, however, that actual fortresses were adorned with brackets and bas-relief sculptures, such as we see here on either side of the forecourt. Such as it is, the so-called Pavilion of Medinet Habu offers a unique example of the high degree of perfection to which the victorious pharaohs of this period had carried their military architecture. Material evidence fails us almost entirely after the reign of Ramses III. Towards the close of the 11th century BC, the high priest of Amen repaired the walls of Thebes, of Gebelin, and of El Hebe opposite Feshen. The territorial subdivision of the country, which took place under the successors of Shishonq, compelled the provincial princes to multiply their strongholds. The campaign of Pianki on the banks of the Nile is a series of successful sieges. Nothing, however, leads us to suppose that the art of fortification had at that time made any distinct progress, and when the Greek rulers succeeded the native pharaohs, they most probably found it at much the same stage as it was left by the engineers of the 19th and 20th dynasties. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from a Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt. As someone who was absolutely obsessed with ancient Egypt as a child, I found that fascinating. Thank you so much for this recommendation, Jeremy. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many illustrations that show what I just read, you'll find a link to a free downloadable ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show notes. If you'd like to connect or recommend a work you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod. I'd really love to hear from you. I'm so glad you could join me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.